Go down the stairs.
Okay, so you're not talking Yiddish.
Was willst du?
Good evening. On behalf of the Toronto Daughters of the Holocaust Survivors, I welcome you to this webinar. I am Dr. Jenny Frummer, and I'm the director of the Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative at Morse Life in Palm Beach, Florida. I also work closely with Next Generations of the Holocaust in Boca Raton. Just a few housekeeping items before we proceed, and I'm going to be handing over this webinar to Esther Michaels. All of you as participants are muted with your cameras turned off. We cannot see any of you on camera because this webinar is in broadcast mode. We will not be able to hear any of you during the presentation or during the Q&A. However, please use the chat feature at the bottom on your black bar if you wish to participate with the panelists. After Dr. Felson's presentation, I will be facilitating a Q&A session for about 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A icon also at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded. You can change the way you view your screen by clicking on the View button at the top right-hand corner of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce and hand you over to Esther Michaels. Unmute, Esther. I should have reminded you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. Thank you all for joining us on this Zoom this evening. This is our fourth get-together after my sister Honey innocently started a Facebook site called the Toronto Daughters of Survivors, and we never thought it would grow so big and so rapidly. Since we had to cancel our last get-together last May and realizing that we don't know when it will be safe enough for us to get together, we decided to Zoom to keep in touch with all our Schwesters. Hope you enjoyed this short video of the memories we have made at our last 3 get-togethers. Frida Langdon summed it up at our last in person, and she sent me an email like many others that I got, and she wrote this. This will tell you how we felt. I had the most amazing, most interesting time. I laughed, I cried, I reminisced, I kveld, I shep nachas. I spoke Mamelution, I met Landsmen I hadn't seen in years. I learned, I shared, I was moved. My neshama was touched and fulfilled. In short, I loved every minute of tonight's experience. Kudos to you and Honey for initiating this sensational group of women and for perpetuating a legacy that would have made all our remarkably special parents so proud. It is up to our generation to never forget and to always share the incredible stories that were left in our care. Many, many thanks for providing us with a forum that encourages us to continue, is what she wrote. I want to thank you all for being here this evening and for being a part of this growing group of Daughters of Survivors. And now to continue this program this evening, I'd like to introduce you to Ellen, who's helped sponsor this event with me, and to introduce our beautiful, wonderful speaker.
Thank you, Esther. It's our honor tonight, and truly it's a great privilege and pleasure to introduce the esteemed psychologist, Dr. Urit Felson. Dr. Urit Felson is a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and traumatic loss with a focus on Holocaust survivors and their descendants. She's an adjunct professor at Columbia University and at Furkov Graduate School of Psychology, Yeshiva University. In addition to her private practice, Dr. Felson is the chair of the Older Adults and Caretakers subgroup in the American Psychological Association Interdivision COVID-19 Task Force. She is also the co-chair of the Trauma Working Group of the NGO Committee on Mental Health in Advising the UN. She's also a board member of the Holocaust Council of Metro West, a member of the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress, and a researcher with the Yale University Trauma Study Group. Dr. Felson is also a daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. The topic for this evening is the unique strengths and vulnerability of children of Holocaust survivors and relationships of adult siblings. We know you'll find this talk enlightening. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Felson.
Thank you very much, Esther and Ellen and Jenny, Dr. Frumer. I am very honored to be here with you this evening, and we'll try to cover as much as possible of these topics that we hope to discuss this evening. So I will share with you the screen just very briefly, and after that I will stop sharing the screen and we'll just talk to you. But there are a few photographs that are very meaningful for me. So I will start first of all by just one second, by sharing with you this, let me see, am I sharing screen? Yes? It's not going down for some reason. Let me try once again. No, okay, we'll just give it up this time. Usually these times, I'm sorry, I'm having a small technical issue here. Are you seeing me and hearing me and everything is okay? Okay, so I would start by showing you the only photograph that I have of my parents' family. It's the family of my father. There's only one photograph. And that's what I do now every time when I start any kind of a lecture, because there's so many people now already beginning to say that this didn't happen. And I think it's so important that we keep showing our photographs and telling our stories. I'll start by a very small introduction before I talk about our unique strengths and vulnerabilities and our relationship with our siblings. Let me start by saying that, first of all, there is no doubt an enormous variability among us, children of survivors. We are not all the same. We are not all alike. But despite this amazing variability, which is the result of many factors, yes, there was a lot of variability among our parents, the survivors, in the countries they came from, in the socioeconomic status that their families had before, in the level of education that they reached before the war prevented them from continuing, in the circumstances that they lived through during the Holocaust, and in the circumstances that they were met with in the countries to which they immigrated. All of these things created tremendous differences, and there are, as I said, tremendous differences amongst us. And yet, there are characteristics and common themes that are very, very much shared by many of us, if not all of us, in different ways. And one of the things that we all know is that to some extent, our parents, the survivors, manifested, of course, remarkable resiliencies. If any kind of a psychologist were to think ahead of the Holocaust about a hypothetical situation such as the Holocaust and what it would do to people, they would surely imagine that the result would be the complete destruction and psychological annihilation of the entire group of people. And that did not happen. Our parents, the survivors, managed as a group to show a lot of positive adaptation and a lot of resilience in their post-war life. However, there were also aspects of their functioning which showed some problems, some difficulties, and often these aspects, showed themselves most importantly in their most intimate relationships, in the family, within the spousal relationship, and in the relationship with their children. And the extent of those difficulties was very different from family to family, from survivor to survivor, which was one of the most important elements in determining how each of us was impacted and in which way we were impacted. And what I would like to say before we go into the specific findings about the second generation is that we all share something that I call the dual reality of trauma, which means that we have a certain knowledge of the events that happened, the trauma that our parents went through, in a way that is very experiential. It's not about the facts, it's not about the historical events, it's an identification with the emotions, with the feelings that somehow were transmitted from our parents to us through our relationship with them. And that creates what I call that dual reality in which we live. It's a reality on one hand of the lives we ourselves live in the countries where we were born, in the relative safety of, normative life. And yet there is another sort of psychological frame of reference, which is very powerful in our experience as children of survivors. And that's the psychological frame of reference of trauma, of what happened that we know happened in the lives of our parents, of inconceivable things, of horribly sadistic and cruel things that we know people are capable of. And that is always somewhere there in our sort of, as I said, in our peripheral psychological frame of reference. And sometimes it can come, oftentimes I use a metaphor to express it, and I say, imagine that we children of survivors live in a world that has a glass floor. Why do I say glass floor? Because I would like you to imagine that the reality into which we ourselves were born is the reality that we live above that glass floor. And the reality of the trauma is underneath that glass floor. It's a kind of a underworld. And glass, I say, in order to sort of invoke the idea of a transparency. It's always there. We may be not looking at it all the time, but it's always somewhat there. And sometimes it can actually come crashing up, overwhelming the way that we respond to all kinds of things in the current reality that we see, because it reminds us so much. Something triggers that reality of trauma. And that has been very much the case for many of us now in the time of the pandemic, when we hear about gun sales becoming so much more common, when we see images of glass shattered in the street of Manhattan at certain days, and so on. So that is important for us to remember. And if we get to it, and if you want, I will share with you some of the findings from my recent study, empirical study, and from meetings such as this one, interactive meetings with second generation, and tell you what we see in terms of our reactions to the pandemic. But going back to the issue of our particular strength and weaknesses or vulnerabilities, I will start by saying that first of all, empirical research did not show any evidence for higher rate of psychological problems or disorders, clinical disorders in the second generation as a group. There is a very small group, about 13% of us, that have the more severe symptoms that sort of indicate something like a second generation syndrome, if you want. The rest of us, what studies show, have elevated scores on various aspects, such as anxiety, a tendency towards depressive experiences, mistrustfulness, hypervigilance, a tendency to perceive slights a little bit too quickly, perhaps. And if we talk about daughters of survivors, gender in psychology is a very powerful thing that is involved in almost any aspect of people's functioning. Almost every aspect is a little bit different when you look at men and women. And the second generation phenomena definitely show certain differences between sons of survivors and daughters of survivors. So, for example, sons of survivors have been shown in empirical studies to have a higher achievement motivation than their American-born peers or American-born to American-born parents, peers, non-Holocaust related, while daughters of survivors have more of a tendency towards higher depressive experiences. But all of these things still remain within what we call the normative range. They don't reach a level where it becomes a clinical problem. What we also see but different nonetheless, while we are within the normative range still, we do score higher, statistically significantly higher on these measures than our non-Holocaust related friends and relatives and neighbors. Now, what the studies show also very clearly are those themes, psychological themes, psychological concerns that adult, highly functioning, normatively functioning people like us, adult children of survivors, describe about their childhoods and adolescence growing up in Holocaust families. And for the most part, the overarching common themes that we see in all of us is an inordinate concern for the emotional well-being of our parents. And because of that inordinate, forgive me, I'll just pour myself a little bit of water and continue. Because of this inordinate concern for the emotional well-being of our survivor parents, we also described that we felt a little bit like we didn't have the autonomy that we wanted as young kids or as adolescents, that we had to curb it in order to not cause them extra anxiety, in order to not do things that would hurt them. We also felt that we had to put their needs ahead of our own more than the non-Holocaust peers that we are being compared to in those studies. And for children of survivors that were daughters, for the daughters of survivors, it was much more so. It seems that there are different ways, in which children respond to the legacy of the Holocaust. And parents also share somewhat different aspects of their stories with different children. And again, gender is a very powerful element here. So sons tended to, for the most part, sons heard more of their parents, especially their fathers, more heroic stories, stories of resilience, stories of resistance, stories of managing to pull one over the Germans, and managing to figure out very interesting and very important ways of getting what they needed. Daughters heard more of the more vulnerable stories, of the sadder stories, and we call it in our language of psychology, we call it co-construction, which means children have a different sensitivity to various aspects in the family life. Daughters are still in our generation socialized to be more about taking care of their parents, taking care of other people, being very relational. Sons in our generation were socialized a little bit differently, a little bit more about achievement, a little bit more about getting out there and achieving, and maybe even achieving that which was prevented from their parents to achieve because of disrupted education and because of all of those issues. So both children have different sensitivities, and parents socialize children differently according to their genders and so on. I will tell you that there are, of course, exceptions to this. And there is a particular group of men, sons of survivors. So let me go back for a minute. As a result of this different socialization of daughters and of sons in our families, daughters, as I say, showed more of those features of anxiety and depressive symptoms. Sons actually were seen to have achieved higher accomplishments in socioeconomic measures than their non-Holocaust related peers, and not so much depressive and anxiety symptoms as the daughters. However, there is a small group of sons of survivors that were, in my experience, in my clinical experience, the most hurt group amongst us, those are sons that had very, very difficult relationships with their fathers, oftentimes very abusive relationships with their fathers. And they were often very brilliant guys, very brilliant boys, but something in the relationship went very, very badly between the father who had post-traumatic stress disorder and could not tolerate the son's attempts for greater autonomy. And things went very badly in that group. And we can talk a little bit more about that if we want. For daughters, what I see as a very unusual finding is that empirical large-scale studies, especially one that took place in Israel, which was not about daughters of survivors, it was about adults in 2001 in general, and amongst them was a very large section of or number of Holocaust survivors. And they were asked about their marriages and about their lives. It was a very in-depth investigation, which came up with the conclusion that daughters of survivors, in comparison to women of the same age and the same socioeconomic status, expressed less satisfaction with their marriages than their peers. They were less satisfied, and they described having entered marriages with men where the relationship was complicated and ambivalent from the beginning. And I thought that was a very interesting finding, because I often meet in my practice or have met women who said to me in simple words, something like, I remember actually one Torontonian who was living in the States, who said, I thought that I have to get married in order to bring my parents naches and to have grandchildren. It was very, very important to my parents. But on the other hand, I didn't think that I could leave them. So I literally said to myself, I'll get married, I'll have children, and then I'll get divorced and I'll come back to Toronto to be near them and take care of them, which is in a way, if you like, what we call a compromise solution. It's when you feel two different things that are very contradictory. You want to, on one hand, satisfy the parents' need for naches. On the other hand, you want to satisfy the parents' need for not being abandoned. And so this was the solution found by many of us: marrying someone that we will be married to, will have children with, will have the life that our parents would have liked their daughter to have. And at the same time, emotionally, we would not be abandoning our parents. Our parents would remain our highest priority. Our highest emotional investment would still be with our parents, and we wouldn't feel as if we abandoned them. I'm just trying to see here for a minute if I can have a full screen, because this is not, I'm not really seeing myself. I'm talking to a screen, but that's okay. We'll continue this way. So I wanted to get to the particular strength and weaknesses that I can share with you, having seen in the clinical work that I do and in studies. One of the beautiful things that we do have from our parents, and it's something that some survivors have, and we see it now in many survivors of trauma as part of what we call post-traumatic growth, is actually a very precious perspective on the beauty of life, on what's really, really important, just because there is such an acute understanding of the fragility of life, of how much was lost, how quickly things can be lost, that it informs a certain very acute appreciation of what is really important in life. And what is really important in life is often relationships for the survivors because of everything that they've lost. We share that. We also, as a group, have a certain acute sense of the fragility of life, and with it, a very acute appreciation of the preciousness of it. Another thing that we very much share as a group, and that's part of what I can tell you about the findings that we see about us during the pandemic. We have a very, very um, uh, acute sense of preparedness for disaster. And some of the people that I've talked with during the pandemic, and especially in the beginning when so many people were so worried and so upset, and second generation would say to me, this is, disaster. I've been prepared for a disaster my entire life. And many of us don't need to be told by the authorities that it would be a good idea to have at home, dry foods and water, at least enough for 2 weeks. Most of us have always had that in our houses, and batteries and things like that, because we live with a certain preparedness for disaster at all times. In fact, another person in the very beginning, in one of the early webinars during the pandemic, said to me, she was working in Brooklyn, and before people were instructed to maintain social distance and to put masks on, and certainly before everything was shut down, she said, I sensed it. I knew that we have to do it. I was telling my boss that it's very important to do it. And everybody was treating me just like an alarmist, as the neurotic alarmist that I'm always being seen as. Of course, in this case, she was, of course, right. Now, many of us are very good at predicting what might go wrong, preparing for what might go wrong, whether it is when we go on a trip, whether it is when we do anything else. And of course, it is a great skill, and it makes us very well able to deal with situations that call for it in life. At the same time, many of us are also acutely aware of the fact that it takes away from our ability to just relax, to take things easy, to enjoy ourselves in times that are non-stressful. And it also sometimes takes away from the quality of our relationship with people who are close to us, who just want to see us relaxed and want to relax with us and can't really feel relaxed near us when we are never relaxed. And it can take away from the quality of the family atmosphere or the relationships, that constant alertness that we have about us. We are also, like our parents, we are good at what is called in the literature about survivors, hardening or steeling. Our parents had to harden themselves or steel themselves in order to be able to push forward, in order to not let the past keep them down. They had to become a little bit unaware or repress a lot of their pain, a lot of the fatigue that they felt in the mornings when they couldn't sleep well at night because of their nightmares. They had to push it aside, they had to repress it and push forward and be able to work hard and to put it aside. And that we can do too. As a second generation, we also have that capacity to push forward, to ignore a little bit and deny our fatigue, or that something hurts us or something aches. And it's a great asset and it's a great strength in many, many situations. It also is possible that it is actually related to some downsides, such as that studies show us that when we enter middle age, we have more medical problems than our non-Holocaust related peers. And one of the explanations might be that we are so good at pushing forward and being kind of starker and not paying attention to this ache or that ache until it actually becomes a much bigger problem than it would have if we had gone to the doctor right away like other people do. We're also pretty good, some of us, at self-denial. It's like doing without, as if we have to prove to ourselves that we too could do without all kinds of things if we had to. Or some people say it to me, it's more like a sense of loyalty to the parents who had to do with so much less. So how can I be so sort of allow myself so much more and so much luxury? A sense of sort of having to be loyal to that sort of aspect of self-denial, which of course may seem in the reality of our socioeconomic status, it may seem to our friends or to our spouse, if he's not a child of survivors, or to our children, it may seem uncalled for and even sometimes sort of neurotically or neurotic or stingy. We also do have an unusual resourcefulness. As one of my patients put it, I can make a meal from dust. And I think that is true about many of us. Just show us 2 cans and a twig of celery, and we can make an amazing meal out of it. It's the resourcefulness that we also inherited from our parents. It's the capacity to make the best and make the most of whatever is there in front of us. And it has also, like everything else, a downside. The downside is that we have a drive to make the best out of anything, to make the best of a broken, sometimes of a broken chair. We have to repair it. We can't just throw it away. And I always thought that there is something about, I'll just, a digression. I gave today a talk in a different context about the sentimental meaning of objects in our families of survivors. And I titled that talk, Inanimate Survivors. And I think that for us, it's not just that we have to be self-denying and sort of make the most of everything and not waste. It's not only because of that that we don't throw a broken chair. We have that kind of sensitivity for the survivor chair, the broken survivor chair, the broken survivor 2 pieces of a china set that we can't just discard with the same ease as other people. But the downside of that resourcefulness, of making the most of everything, shows itself sometimes in situations such as a relationship that is not so good, whether it's a job or a boss that's not right for you anymore, that's not treating you well enough. The need to make that relationship work no matter what, which we bring with us from the relationship with our parents, where we had to make it work. We had to be very sensitive to how they feel. Children have to make the relationship with their parents work as well as possible, because they don't have the option of looking for another family and looking for another set of parents. And our survivor parents were amazing, as Esther said, in many, many ways. But as I mentioned in the very beginning, some of the problems that remain, that are the inevitable result of having gone through so much trauma, lead to irritability, lead to high anxiety in the survivor parents, lead to all kinds of things that made it very difficult for them to tolerate some of the normative aspects that are not so easy in the relationship between parents and children who grow up and become adolescents and need to go through all kinds of normative struggles. And yet we learned what not to do is not to upset our parents too much because they suffered so much, not to get them too revved up, not to get them too anxious, and make it work in the best possible way for us. We take the same attitude and import it into marriages, into friendships, into work settings, where sometimes actually the good solution is not to try harder to make it work, but to actually leave, because we do have options. And as adults, these are not our parents. We can actually step out of a bad relationship and find something better. Another thing that we have, which is a great strength and vulnerability, is we are trained as empathic empaths, or our capacity for empathy is something that we are trained for from a very, very early age. Again, because of our sensitivity to the suffering of our parents and to the moods and the moments in which our parents seemed sad or overburdened. We have that ability to sense what other people need, what other people feel, and sometimes it almost overwhelms us. It's almost like, being the wife of a physicist, one metaphor that comes to my mind is, many times, psychologically speaking, our empathy, our ability to sense what the other person, whether it's a spouse or a child or our parent or a friend, our ability to sense what they need and want from us overpowers our sense of what is actually good for us. Where are the appropriate boundaries? We can be such caretakers, especially as the daughters of survivors, much more so even than the sons of survivors. We might have a problem maintaining the appropriate boundaries and remembering what our goals are, what our direction is, what is good for us and what is beyond that. It's almost, as I say, the metaphor that comes from the physics world is what happens to a very small magnet when they're near a very big magnet. They just get floops, sort of attached to it without control. That's almost the way that I see how we, daughters of survivors, sometimes respond to the needs of those that we care about who are near us. It almost overcomes us and overcomes our boundaries and our need to maintain, uh, uh, ourselves within our own sort of boundaries. The of course, the good side, as I said, is a great capacity for empathy. The downside is that it can overcome our sense of what is good for us and where our boundaries are. Let me just ask you, the time is, we started at 7:30. We have another, how many minutes until Q&A?
15, Dr. Fellison.
15, okay. So I'll just mention one more strength, which is a strength and a vulnerability, which was very, I think, powerful in the lives of daughters of survivors, again, not sons. And that is that because we were so much used to and internalized the need to put other people's needs ahead of our own, many of us did not develop the capacity to be comfortable with our own assertiveness, with our own needs, to even become aware of our own needs and to use assertively our own our own assertiveness in the service of our own needs, because we grew up feeling that when we do that, somebody suffers, our parents suffer. The classic example is from a patient who told me, in Israel, the schools always go on long trips once a year, an annual trip. And we go hiking and we go climbing the mountains and all of those things. And it's a wonderful experience. And many survivor parents were very, very anxious about this when their children went on these trips. And not one, but a particular one, told me how every year before the Tiyul Shnati, before the annual trip of the class that everybody basically went out on, she would cry for the whole week that she wants to go on the trip. Her mother would cry the whole week that she doesn't want her to go on the trip. And in the end, she would always end up going on that trip. But think about, what does a child internalize from such an experience? She internalized the sense that when she gets what she wants, it's at the terrible cost of her mother crying the whole week and her mother giving in so that she can go have a nice time. Yes? So we take that with us, and many of us, as a result, I think, found themselves very, very talented, very, very competent daughters of survivors who find themselves in positions such as the assistant to the boss, the secretary in the school, who runs the show, and everybody knows that she's the one who runs the show and knows everything and does everything, but she's not the one who has the title and the commensurate salary that goes along with what she actually does. Because the capacity to do it, we have, but we can do it much more easily in the service of somebody else's needs, somebody else's goals. Then we can put it to work, but not so much for our own goals and not so much for our own direction. Speaking about the siblings, let me quickly go over there, because we tried to sort of combine a few very big topics that are each usually a talk in and of itself. But let me try to say a few things that are very, very important about the way I see sibling relationships in our families. It has struck me over the 25 years of working as a clinician with Holocaust families that there are much, much more frequent cutoffs and severe resentments between adult siblings of children of survivors than I see in other families that I treat. And it became a very intriguing subject for me. And what I see often in the family is that there is one who went out achieving and doing and getting things and did not share with their parents their problems or any kind of challenges that they went through. Sometimes it's as extreme as not even having shared with the parents at some point in adulthood that the person had cancer, was going through cancer treatments, or had a heart attack, or had a bankruptcy. And the other sibling is the one who stays close by, lives much more a life much more intertwined with the parents, oftentimes less successful professionally, and many, many times, if there is a son and a daughter in the family, the one that stays close by is naturally more often the daughter. The one who went far away and achieved and did all kinds of things in the world is the son. And what happens is that the daughter stays nearby, takes care of the parents, is in much more daily contact with them. There are much more frequent frictions in the relationship between the parents and the child who lives nearby. The child who lives far away, when they come to visit, it's like the Queen of England came to visit, and it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. And that, of course, is a little bit painful for the child who lives nearby and takes care of the parents all the time. Also, the other thing that we know is that emotional communication in families of Holocaust survivors was not simple. It was complex. It was not easy to talk about all kinds of things, not just things related to the Holocaust, but all kinds of things in relationship. Relationships were not something that was discussed very openly, certainly not negative feelings in the relationship within the family. And so what happens often is that the survivor parents share with the child who lives nearby their pain about the fact that the child who lives further away is so far away, doesn't come often enough. When they come for 3 days. And during these 3 days, they go out to visit friends or to do I don't know what. And anyway, they stay in a hotel and not at the parents' home because it's more convenient for them. And so the parents express a sense of having been somewhat emotionally abandoned by this child and very hurt by it and very sad. At the same time, the same parents complain to that successful child who's far away, or don't complain or just share all of the problems that they see in the child nearby and in their lives, the fights that they have, the friction, the fights that this child has with her husband, which she somehow either shared or they saw. They share all of these problems, and in a sense, the child who left and went away is getting very upset about it. And then I get, depending on which child I speak with, the child who lives far away says about the child who lives nearby, she's killing our parents. She's killing my parents. She's telling them about every problem she has. She's taking away from them, their peace of mind in their last years. Sometimes that child who lives nearby also needs some financial support because she didn't go and take that job that would take her far away or that would make her too busy to take care of the parents. So she's draining our parents in every possible way. The child that's nearby says, my brother who lives in California, he's got it good. He comes to visit twice a year, and then he's like, the prince came visiting, and he doesn't care, and he doesn't care enough, not about them, not about me. He comes for 3 days, he's done his thing. What I'm trying to say to you is that there are often enormously potent resentments that get built up, and they got built up not just in adulthood, they got built up throughout the growing up years in ways which I don't have the time to get into right now. But this way of talking in the family, the parents sharing their pain in a moment of anger or upset about one sibling, not directly with that sibling, but with the other sibling, deposits the bad feeling in the other sibling. And because it's so intense, and because we all, as children of survivors, are so intent on protecting our parents from pain, when we see the other sibling causing pain, we really hold it very much against them. So what I'm saying is that when you have these very mutually strong judgments about each other, take into account that actually there was a lot that was created unintentionally, but was created through the relationship with the parents in such a way that it fed these resentments. Negative feelings were unintentionally deposited in one sibling against the other. And the sibling who stayed, the sibling who sometimes even it's not just the sibling who stayed and take care, sometimes it's the sibling who stayed and needed continuous rescuing by the parents. And a classic example that I give is my patient who said to me, I have a good family, a beautiful house in the suburbs in New Jersey, the American dream. I want to take my parents from Brooklyn to my house for the weekend. I tell them, I'll take you in the car, door to door. They say to me, we don't know, we don't feel so good, we'll see. My sister, who has a terrible marriage and a terribly chaotic life on Long Island, tells them that she needs them. They schlep to her by public transportation with pots of cooked food. For that, they have the koyach. What does it mean? I'm trying to show you that in some ways, the child who needs constant rescuing is able, those are the facts, to animate the parent and to call forth in them the sense of being needed, the sense of resilience, the sense of endurance that makes them a lot more animated, vital, stronger than the child who's got the good life, who's trying to give them just great experiences and naches. So essentially, each child has followed a certain subscript in the relationship with the parents, not a conscious subscript, not something that the parents consciously communicated, and not something that the child necessarily consciously identified with. But these are subscripts of trauma that created very, very polarized types of adaptation in the siblings that then create a lot of mutual judgments and a lot of mutual resentments. Try to keep it in mind when you're thinking about what happens or what still is happening between you and siblings, and try to at least make sure that cousins, the third generation, can have a relationship with each other, because one of the great losses that happened to us, the second generation, was the fact that we did not have an extended family. And let's not try to reenact the destruction of the extended family because of our problematic relationship with our own siblings. I'll stop here for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paulson. And there have been a lot of questions. So I'm going to try and get through as many as we can in about 15 minutes, and please forgive us if we don't get to all of them. I'll start with the one that you just mentioned in terms of cousins and reenacting those relationships with cousins and trying to mitigate that. As it relates to children of survivors, second gens, the question is, do we make our own children feel responsible for their happiness the way maybe our survivor parents could have done to us, more so than our peers?
You mean, do we make our children feel more responsible for our own happiness the way that we felt about our parents? Yes, a little. Studies do show that we are a lot more like our parents in some ways than we would probably like to think. There is a transmission of many of those things, and we do more of it than our peers. But I will say that there are some things that that are important to mention. The third generation in recent, there is now a growing number of studies, empirical studies about the third generation and their relationship to us and all of that. They definitely have a much more open and much warmer relationship with us than we had with our parents. They do feel, all in all, that we did a good job trying to cope with a difficult legacy, and that we created warm homes, warm relationships with them. But they do have some of those things more than their peers, meaning they do feel that they don't have quite as much autonomy, that we don't encourage their autonomy to the same degree that their peers get from their parents, and that there is some similarity in some of those overprotective patterns. However, there is also a diluting element. There was a diluting element for the second generation, namely families where only one survivor parent married a non-survivor had less of an impact on the children, the second generation. And the third generation, if there's one parent who is a non-survivor, the third generation is essentially indistinguishable from their peers. So it gets diluted by that fact. And if the survivor parent is a mother, second generation, we as mothers have a little bit more of an impact in the transmission than fathers.
So the answer is yes, is what you were saying.
The answer is yes, but, and the answer is that as colleagues from Israel concluded in a very poetic way, which I can't quite quote word for word, but the essence of what their series of studies showed was that it takes more than one generation to overcome this kind of trauma.
Thank you. You mentioned quite a few times about balancing needs. You mentioned self-denial, maybe that as 2Gs we deprive ourselves. And at the end of the day, sort of, what about our own needs? How would we prioritize our own needs? And how do we not let life be lost within our generation because we are meeting the needs of our parents instead of possibly our own needs, our own accomplishments get put aside? Any more comments that you might have about that?
Well, I think that two things. First of all, I think just like in every aspect of the way I see my work as a therapist, you know, in every aspect, self-reflection and self-knowledge is key to being able to do better. We have to know what our vulnerabilities are in order to be able to watch against it, right? If I know that my tendency to be a caretaker can take me a little bit over the border, over the boundary, and I can do a bit too much and forget what's good for me, then I am if I know it, I have a better chance of stopping and thinking about it when it comes up and saying to myself, okay, wait a second, you know you have this issue. So in this particular case, what do you think is really the rational thing? And where do you get drawn by your irrational tendencies? Yes. So self-knowledge is key to having some kind of an ability to use our mature adult mind and to make decisions that are realistic and appropriate to the situation that we're in now, as opposed to an automatic reaction from the program that was installed in us before we were even aware that such a program is being installed in us, and we just learn to behave this way. It gives us better choice. And what helps us make better choices once we have that capacity to know some of these vulnerabilities is that in general, empirical studies about the development of adults, we keep developing. Things change throughout life. And lifelong development studies show us that somewhere after 45, 55, many people come into their own more than they did in previous years. And it includes women owning their assertiveness more and their leadership abilities more and what they need more, and men owning a little bit more of their vulnerable sides, or what would be called, the feminine side, more emotional, a little bit more open, a little bit more vulnerability. And that helps us, that development at this point can help us, daughters of survivors, if we now are much more comfortable just because of our age, coming into our own, owning our assertiveness, owning a little bit better what we need, we can bring that capacity to bear once we know what our vulnerabilities are. And lastly, I will say something which is very sad, but nonetheless true. Many, many, many of us discover that however sad it is that our parents are gone, that our parents being gone opens up a new chapter in life. Because until now, especially as daughters, we are very, very much torn internally and taken up by our concern and care for our parents. All of a sudden, when they're gone, there is a different chapter in which we can turn back inside towards ourselves, towards our spouses, towards other things that we were not able to focus on in the same way before, and we're not able to give ourselves permission to fully turn our emotional energy into before.
It sounds so bittersweet when you describe it that way. And you mentioned spouses, Dr. Felsen, and one of the question is that as second geners, we ourselves are getting older, and not only have we lost our parents, but some may be losing spouses as well.
Yeah.
And the question is wondering whether there is any data related to reactions to the death of a spouse, specifically in terms of grieving as a 2G.
So there isn't a lot of empirical data, but there is some data, and there is some data about the impact of trauma history in general on the reactions to later traumas in life. And I believe that there is no question. Also, from a 6-part seminar that I did specifically about that, about loss for second generation, I think that there is no doubt that our response to loss is very, very different. And our response to our own aging is very, very different. And about that, there is already empirical data. And I always say, think about it. Many of us, I grew up not knowing any of our grandparents. Most of the people around me did not have grandparents. One family had a grandparent, we all called her Oma because she was like the Oma for all of us. So in families that did not see normative aging and in which death is something that is that from the beginning is a terrible thing that we knew happened under terrible, terrible circumstances and left such a sense of mourning and grief, even in the most highly functioning families that we grew up in. It's a very different backdrop for loss. It's not like Tuesdays with Maury, where this Maury is able to take his own demise in such a gracious way. And he talks about the fact that, he's thinking of his childhood and all the wonderful care that he got. It's a different view of aging and of loss. And we have a much harder time with loss than our peers, which is a reason to, for us as professionals, I think it's incredibly important to prepare forums, the solidarity of a group that you feel that you belong to is the greatest protection against depression and against the blows of life. And as we age, it's a wonderful thing that Esther and Ellen are doing by creating this group, for example, because as we age, we need more than ever a group that we feel that we belong to, that cares about us, that will be there for us when we suffer the blows of life.
Amen. Dr. Felsen, you've spoken about siblings and sort of the relationships and the estrangement that tends to happen more amongst survivor families than their peers. And there've been some questions about being an only child and the impact of being an only child without those siblings in relationship to survivor parents.
So I don't know exactly what the question is.
The question is if you are an only child, and you mentioned that sometimes males and females were socialized differently in the family, and sort of what happens to siblings as an only child, what happens?
There's only, yes, I see. Well, I think that the overarching finding, regardless even of gender, over gender, which is such an important variable, the overarching finding is that and by the way, studies about the second generation paved the way to the entire understanding of intergenerational trauma and to empirical studies of other groups in which there was extreme trauma after the Holocaust. And we see the same thing in those families too. We see an overarching finding that children of parents who suffered massive trauma have an inordinate concern for the well-being of their parents. It's understandable, yes? And the degree to which the parent, the survivor parent, continues to suffer from what we consider post-traumatic symptoms, the degree to which the parent continues to suffer from it is very, very impactful in terms of how much it will influence the child. So if you have a single child, first of all, whether it's a daughter or a son, they will carry the burden of all of those effects. They need to take care of, they need to achieve, they need to not abandon, they need to bring naches, they need to do this and they need to do that. Now, some children will actually struggle very, very hard to fulfill all of these obligations and all of these contradictory obligations. And some children collapse under this. And those are some of the most damaged people amongst us who collapsed under the burden of these enormous expectations that they felt and that they felt unable to fulfill no matter how much. And some of them, in a way, in an attempt to survive somehow, and those are sometimes single children and sometimes not. Sometimes one child in the family who actually was the one who felt the most burdened and suffocated by these impossible expectations that they perceived, they even cut off from the parents. There are even many families, not one and two. There is in fact a special program for survivors who are estranged from their children in Brooklyn, because sometimes the weight of it is so much and it's so difficult. I have seen people who didn't even show up for their parents' funeral.
These are very difficult and challenging relationships, and there are
Very
a number of
difficult and
questions.
challenging.
Yeah, there are a number of questions around that, including the experience of guilt that sometimes we can feel as second generation when our parents are gone.
Well, in fact, guilt is a very, very important thing to address, because as I mentioned before in some of the things that I sort of rattled off, is that it's very difficult to fulfill the obligations, the commitment, the loving duties that we feel towards our parents. What they've been through is so enormous, and what they lost is so enormous that it's very hard to balance it out. And so no matter what we do and what we achieve, it's going to be an impossible mission. And if we try, we still are never going to necessarily feel that that was good enough. So guilt is almost an inbuilt feature of the second generation experience. It's almost impossible to feel when the parents are gone that, okay, you know, we really did our best. And yeah, some of us are lucky enough that they feel this way, but many don't. And it's not necessarily because they weren't good enough children. It's sometimes because it's not really possible to be good enough.
In hearing you speak, and I've heard you many times, I always feel like I can take a deep breath sometimes, because you really help explain what so many of us have felt. I think we have time for one more question, and really there are just so many. But just shifting gears a little bit, since you have spoken about the transmission of trauma, I wonder if you could just comment on epigenetics.
So epigenetics is a very, very interesting field. It is not without its controversies yet, but all in all, the idea is that certain very, very extreme deprivations over a significant long time, like what the Holocaust was, like what the 6 months of the winter of starvation in Holland was when the Nazis prevented supplies from getting in there, like what the POWs during the Civil War here suffered, that these kinds of experiences have been shown to be associated with certain things in the offspring of such people. And epigenetics is a field that looks at these changes in the manifestation, the expression of the DNA of the children of such people. And you know, Jenny, you heard me say it before. I think for me, who's not a biologist and not a a scientist in those areas, for me, the most helpful way of thinking about what does epigenetic change mean. So I'll start by saying, it's the study of the way that changes in the manifestation, as I said, the expression of our DNA, but not changes in the DNA. The DNA doesn't change, but the DNA is expressed differently because certain segments, the myelination of certain segments changes. Myelination is the same as the myelination that we have on electrical cords, the plastic. If you think about that plastic being peeled off in certain sections, that's what it means when the myelination in some sections is intact and in some sections it gets sort of exposed. And as I said, for me, a good metaphor is our DNA doesn't change. We have the same DNA that we have, that our parents, that we inherited. And that's like a piano, it doesn't change. But now take that piano with the same keys and tape down some of them. Now the same piano with the same keys plays a different music. So, for example, one epigenetic change, such as the ones that are perhaps related to the fact that I mentioned before, that when we reach middle age and above, we have more medical conditions than our peers. For example, it is hypothesized that because our parents starved for such a long time, the area in our DNA that is involved in the metabolism of nurturing substances changed, so that we, with the same DNA, we now are holding on to everything that we get from our food in a way that makes us much more inclined in middle age and above to prediabetes, diabetes, high cholesterol, all of that, because our DNA did not change, but the epigenetic change is such that it's preparing the children of our parents who are starving for an environment of starvation. Yeah, but thankfully, we're not living in an environment of starvation. So it makes us a little more prone to diabetes and to high cholesterol. So epigenetics is that field that looks into all of these changes in the expression of our DNA because of things that happened to our parents. And it's very, very important, or it's going to be very, very important to find out how to reverse those changes, right? If 6 months of starvation or 4 years of starvation can change the DNA in that way, how can we change it back?
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Felsen. There have been so many more questions than time that we have to get through all of them. I don't know if you want to say just some last thoughts, and then after that, Ellen is going to take over. And Ellen, just a reminder to unmute. So, Dr. Felsen, do you have any parting words?
Yes, I think that I would just like to emphasize what I actually mentioned before, that it is extremely useful at this point in life to take the time to take stock of our strengths and our vulnerabilities and the unique legacy that we carry with us, because we do have the benefit of what studies show is wisdom that comes at this point in life that allows us to see a lot of things from a different perspective than we saw it earlier. In fact, it allows us to see a lot of things from different perspectives at the same time. And it allows us to then get a different view of ourselves, of our parents, of the way that we do things, so that we can do things in a better way for ourselves and for all those around us at this point in life and onwards. And as I said, Esther and Ellen, I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing by creating this forum, because at this age in general, and at this time of the pandemic, with so many things happening around, there is no better thing than creating forums where we can be at least virtually together, if not face to face. But as I called it in one of my recent papers, web-based second best way of being together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Felsen, for your illuminating and informative talk. Your research and findings help us better understand our unique history. We're so forever grateful to you for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us tonight, and we look forward to another evening together. We wish everyone a good night. Please stay safe and stay well. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.